Okay, hello. We have two topics this week about the socialist bloc and really about consumption and leisure time and consumerism. And what I wanted to do in this week's sessions, the 2 weeks that we're having, the two sessions that we're having this week, is take a step back from the political narrative, at least a little bit, in both of these sessions. And think a little bit about how people lived under communism, lived under socialism. It's one of the things that I mentioned that we would be considering at the beginning of this module, not just the political story, not just the big events, but also what life was like under the bloc. So in this lecture, I want to talk a little bit about consumerism, and in the second lecture, we'll talk a little bit about movies and how filmmakers and directors and screenwriters coped with the restrictions which the regime set upon them, and nevertheless attempted to sort of articulate and tell stories. Now, what I think is quite interesting about this particular session about consumers and consumption is the following thing. It's often believed, it was often believed for a very long time, that consumption and consumerism was something that people had in Western Europe, but people didn't have under communism. That this was something which was one of the key dividing lines between the Western world and the Eastern Bloc. Now, what I guess before anything, I should sort of try and explain a little bit what consumption is and what I mean by consumerism and what I mean by consumption. At the end of the Second World War, immediately at the end of the Second World War, throughout Europe and throughout the world, people were under rationing and restrictions, and the devastation of the Second World War was still felt very keenly throughout the continent and throughout the world. But this kind of started to change at the end of the 1950s. There was a sort of economic miracle, an economic boom throughout Western Europe. Countries which seemed to have been very hard hit by the war made a pretty quick recovery. So by the time we get to the late 50s, the early 1960s, the economies of the Western countries are in pretty good shape. Actually, there is still war damage, and then there are, of course, psychological and physical scars caused by war. And in countries like Germany, what is now Western Germany, the damage was particularly severe, was particularly serious. But nevertheless, because of the Marshall Plan, because of the European economic cooperation, for various reasons, the Western economies were starting to do pretty well. And essentially what happened was many people who in the past, the vast majority of people would not have had, they would have had money for rent and they would have had money for essential living, but they would not have had a lot of money left over after that. They would not have had a lot of what we call disposable income. And in addition to that, the kind of work that people did was very labor intensive. People would be working sort of 6, sometimes 7 days per week, 10 or 12 hours per day, and there wouldn't be a huge amount of time left over. So people didn't have time for leisure, and even if they did, they didn't have the money to spend on leisure. Now, because of advancements in technology, because of the economic miracle that I've been describing of the 1950s, that transformed in Europe from the beginning of the 1960s onwards. All of a sudden, even your average person, the majority of people, not everyone, of course, and it depended on the country that you were talking about, and some countries were not as wealthy as others, but nevertheless, a vast number of people who in the past would not have had disposable income, extra money at the end of the month, extra time, now did. And what that meant was a new sector of the economy started to burgeon, started to boom. The consumerist section, the consumption section. So people had money to buy cars, for example. People started to have money to buy television sets, labor-saving devices like washing machines and irons and this kind of thing. People all of a sudden could travel abroad, or they could travel on holiday. They could take 2 weeks off, or a weekend off, and they could go to Blackpool, or to the southern coast of France, or perhaps to the northern Baltic Sea, and they could spend some time in recreation with their families, playing tennis or swimming, or doing whatever. So that was a kind of a transformation, a new way of living, and a new sector of the economy, the consumption, the consumerist sector. Now, it's very often wrongly felt or wrongly believed that this phenomenon, the phenomenon of consumption, the phenomenon of consumerism, did not exist under communism. The people there were much more impoverished. That they didn't have, they didn't have these sorts of things. That the phenomenon of consumption and consumerism was exclusively something that belonged in the capitalist West, and because of the ideological systems, the ideological regimes under which people in Central and Eastern Europe lived, there was no consumption per se. Their lives ran in a very different way. Now, in fact, we'll see in today's lecture that that's not true. That although these countries were indeed poorer, although the values were very different, and although at least initially the economies were organized in a very different way, nevertheless, this phenomenon of consumption around about the same time, from the 1960s onwards, was present also under communism, was present in Central and Eastern Europe. Now, we'll talk a little bit about how that came about, and also how eventually it was kind of lost. This sort of, this prosperity and this consumption and this leisure time sort of diminished as we get to the 1980s, and maybe we'll talk about some of the consequences of that too. But basically, that's the aim of today's session, to try to dispel the notion, to dispel the myth. There was no such thing as as leisure time and consumption. To try and look a little bit about what to prove that there was, but also to look a little bit about what that was like. Now, if we turn to slide number 1, incidentally, that's two women enjoying corn on the cob at Lake Balaton. You can't see Balaton, it's quite a tight shot. Lake Balaton is a large freshwater lake in Hungary, which became a very popular tourist destination under communism, not just for Hungarians, but also people from Poland and people from the Baltics and this kind of thing. But very many people would come to Balaton, and there's a large amount of touristic infrastructure, so hotels and cabins and dance halls and recreation centres and this kind of thing. It's been in the news a little bit recently, at least in Central Europe it has, because it has emerged that the president-elect of the United States, at the time of speaking, the president-elect Joe Biden holidayed with his wife there in 1977, and then the National Archives of Hungary have published some documents about how he met with communist officials, kind of things they discussed, and after this he was a senator at the time, a relatively young one, and after this he went to Balaton with his wife, and then they had a sort of, I think this might even have been his honeymoon. So it's very interesting. I mean, it goes to show, doesn't it, that Biden has been around for a very long time. That we're talking about something that's almost 50 years ago, 45 years ago. But nevertheless, Biden was around. So his political career spans a huge amount of time. Okay, now in slide number 2 is the book that I would recommend, and it's one of the books that I've put actually in the booklet as well. A collection of essays edited by Paulina Bren and Mary Neuberger, which deal with this issue that I've just explained. The book is called Communism Unwrapped, and it really tells the whole story of this side of communist life, or this life under the communist regimes, how consumption emerged, how consumerism emerged, what it looked like when it was around, how it started to diminish in the 1970s and the 1980s. There are some very good essays there which deal with things like holidays and shopping and watching television and all of the kind of things that we would associate with leisure. So I urge you to take a look at that book. and this really gives you a sort of a sense of what it was like to live and what it was like to to enjoy free time under the communist regime. So that's in slide number 2. Okay, let's move on to slide number 3. Let's have a quick recap. At the end of the Second World War, as I mentioned in our lectures 1 week ago, the lectures that I posted last week, in the initial phase, the phase of what I'd call building socialism, the Stalinist era from 1945 and until Stalin's death in 1953. First of all, the devastation which the countries in Central and Eastern Europe experienced was particularly severe, particularly heavy. Much of the fighting had taken place in countries like Poland. There had been a civil war, as I've talked about, in Yugoslavia, same in Albania. Cities in Romania and Bulgaria and Hungary, like Budapest and Bucharest and Sofia, had been bombed by the Nazis, but also by the Allies towards the end of the war. So there had been a huge amount of devastation and a huge amount of destruction. And the initial phase, when the socialists came into power, the communists came into power at the end of the Second World War, was very much about recovery. It was very much about attempting to rebuild these economies out of the destruction to which they had been subjected during the Second World War. Now, it was also, of course, about transformation. It was also about turning the economies, turning those countries away from agriculture and towards a sort of industrial base. So things like the 5-year plan, things like the collectivization of agriculture. In the initial phase, the early sort of the first decade or so after the end of the Second World War, the economies of these countries were almost entirely geared towards heavy industry, collectivization, building factories, moving people out of the villages and into the cities. Now, I told you that this was a very sort of for many people, a very exciting time. There were new opportunities. There was a sense that the communists were really looking towards the future. That they were moving away from the failures of the interwar period. They were moving away from the bleak times of the Second World War, and maybe they were creating something that was much better and much more superior and much more impressive. Now, they did have very many successes. The accomplishments in this period were quite, in many cases, quite impressive. If we look at slide number 4. This is an image of a city called, what was then called, Stalinváros, which in Hungarian means Stalin's city. This was an industrial hub, an industrial city, which was built out of nothing, built from scratch essentially by the communists. There was some sort of resources in the ground, I think some lignite or something that could be mined out of the grounds, some coke, some coal or something like this. So the communists came in, they built factories, they built mines, but they also built the infrastructure so that the people who would work in these mines could live in this, in this space. There were places to live. There were residences, schools, hospitals, sports facilities, parks. The communists thought very holistically about this kind of early project of building socialism. They wouldn't come in and simply, as some corporations do now, simply build residences and leave everything else. Leave everything else as not being profitable. The communists really did attempt to sort of build an entire infrastructure, an entire ecosystem of life and living in these new places. I think in last week we also talked about Nowa Huta, the new city, which was built just outside of Krakow. And I think I maybe put up on the slide Catherine LeBeau's book about how this city was also built completely from scratch. How it was just built out of nothing, and this has been a model in Stalin's Soviet Union, in places like Ukraine, entire mining cities, vast civilizations had been built out of nothing, had been built out of the ground, and this was also happening in Central and Eastern Europe. So, what did this mean? The first decade, it really meant that on top of recovering from the war, on top of trying to reconstruct and rebuild people's lives and rebuild the infrastructure that had been destroyed, the communists were also directing all of the economic efforts and all of the economic energies towards a kind of industrialization, towards a Sovietization of the economy and also, of course, of society. So moving people out of villages, moving them into the towns, into the cities, and really transforming, transforming the countries in question. That meant that there was not a huge amount of time left over to focus on things like the economy, things like consumption, things like consumerism. There was not a huge amount of interest, a huge amount of effort expended on those areas, at least initially. Now, this kind of changed in rhythm with the kind of political transformations that I was talking about in our previous classes. If we move to slide 5, you'll remember from a couple of sessions ago, we talked about the transformations that took place at the end. When Stalin died, the rise to power of Nikita Khrushchev, the apparent reorganization and reorientation of the of relations with the Eastern Bloc countries, so relations between the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc, and the apparent sort of new direction that the countries that these countries could take. Now we'd seen, hadn't we, in countries like Poland and Hungary, where the communist regimes were particularly unpopular or they lacked legitimacy under the Stalinist period. The people like Imre Nagy used this process of de-Stalinization, used these apparent changes that were taking place in relations between the Eastern Bloc and the Soviet Union to attempt to sort of forge a new path in the system and in the communist bloc as well. Now we'd also seen, of course, that went too far. As far as Khrushchev was concerned. And in this image, we have a picture of Imre Nagy on trial in 1958. And essentially, this was a show trial in the classic Soviet sense. Nagy was accepting guilt for pretty much everything that had happened, and in this way saving many of his comrades. But he himself, of course, was executed for this change. Now, the process of de-Stalinization and the end of de-Stalinization did indeed, in many ways, end the autonomous paths that people like Imre Nagy were attempting to pursue. But nevertheless, the end of Stalin also meant decisively the end of those big sort of projects, those big economic projects that had been adapted and adopted from the Soviet Union, but in many cases were seen or were felt to have been failing. So the death of Stalin was a chance, for example, to revisit the issue of collectivization of agriculture. Now, collectivization, as I mentioned a couple of weeks ago, was the process wherein private farmers and private agriculturists, their land was taken away from them. It was reorganized into vast collective farms, and these farmers were sort of brought into state-run farms to try to sort of work together and to try to sort of to try to make this part of the economy to put this part of the economy at the disposal of the state of the national economy. Now, in many ways, collectivization had not been a success, just as it had not been a success in many cases in the Soviet Union. In the 1930s, you would have thought they would have learned from that. So the death of Stalin was a chance to retreat from some of the unpopular policies, some of the economic policies that were proving unpopular with the populations in these countries. It was a chance for reorientation. So this was one thing. Now, the other thing in slide number 6 is a very famous incident which took place when Nikita Khrushchev, as the General Secretary of the Soviet Union, visited the United States. It was the first time that a Soviet leader visited the US in the history of the Soviet Union, and this took place in 1959. Now you can see here an image in slide number 6 of Khrushchev alongside who was at the time the vice president, Richard Nixon. Of course, he would go on much later to become the president in the 1970s. Richard Nixon, of course, became the president of the United States. But at this time, he was just the vice president. Now, on this state journey, which has become a bit of a legendary trip, Nikita Khrushchev saw many things. Visited the White House, visited, of course, all of the the great U.S. Landmarks in Washington, D.C., went out to the Midwest, and that's all kinds of things. But in this picture, he's visiting a trade fair. And Nixon is walking him through, and showing him essentially how the American household, the kind of things that the American household enjoys now. That in this trade fair, then just as now, there's things like a mock living room with a television and a couch. There's a mock kitchen with, as you can see here, with a washing machine and with a spin dryer and with a sink and with running water and with all of this sort of thing. And this was very much a deliberate photo op, as you can see here, very carefully planned. This being the height of the Cold War, or one of the heights of the Cold War. The U.S. and Nixon were attempting to show that this system, what they had created and the way they lived, the way Americans lived, was vastly superior to the way the Soviets lived. So this is kind of soft diplomacy. It was not about pointing missiles at one another, although that would come quite soon with the Cuban Missile Crisis in the early 60s. It was not about banging the table. It was not about hard political warfare. It was much more about soft power. It was much more about attempting to show very publicly that this capitalist system, this Western system, was superior to the Soviet one. And of course, the Soviets did precisely the same thing. Now, it is said that Khrushchev experienced a moment of panic when he was at this trade fair, and you can kind of see it on his face in this image. He was looking at things like this American kitchen. He was looking at the living room. He was looking at all of these incredible goods, things like washing machines, television sets, comfort sofas, electricity, all of the things that the Americans could now mass produce relatively cheaply and sell to the average American household relatively cheaply too. Now, Khrushchev, it is said on the way back, the long flight back from Washington, D.C. To Moscow, was in a state of kind of turmoil and panic. The communist system, the Soviet system, had always promised to deliver, the Soviet people and the people of Eastern and Central Europe out of poverty, out of hardship, out of exploitation, and into a much more prosperous, better future. Going right back to the foundational texts of Marx, people, things like Capital and the manifesto of the Communist Party. It was always said that the communist society and the path towards the communist society would be something like a path towards utopia. It would be a path. It would be a path towards a much more superior system, a much more superior society, and a much more superior system of living. It could be argued at this stage that possibly. Lifelong communists like Khrushchev or the leadership in Central and Eastern Europe genuinely believed these things. They had been committed to this cause throughout their lives, and they were true believers in the ability of communism. And the communist system, once implemented in societies, could really sort of deliver happiness and prosperity and wealth to the people under which who were living under the communist system. Now, quite simply, this was an issue for Khrushchev. He saw the way the Americans were living, and he was it was clear that these sorts of things, this level of prosperity, this level of comfort, was not present in the Soviet Union, and it was not present in the satellite states of communist Eastern and Central Europe. The average household did not have a washing machine in the 1950s in Poland, in Hungary, in Bulgaria, to say nothing of Russia or Ukraine or Belarus, or for God's sakes, Uzbekistan or Tajikistan. The average family did not have a television. No one had a television. The average family didn't have a car. Nobody had a car. Almost nobody. I mean, the party bosses had cars. They had limousines. And they had luxury, but the average person did not. Now, for Khrushchev, this was a real problem. In a sense, it was as if the promise of communism, or rather, communism was perhaps not living up to its great promises of prosperity and better living. That in fact, in the hideous sort of exploitative West, it seemed, from the evidence of his own eyes, Khrushchev's own eyes, that the Westerners were living in a better way. Remember that in the 1950s, this was not like 2020. Okay, nothing is like 2020, but it was not like we would normally be living. Travel to the US was not a simple thing. International travel was something that almost nobody did at this stage, although that would soon change. And even somebody like Khrushchev, like I say, this was the first trip to the United States, one of his first trips to the Western world. And this was a real eye-opener for him too. He simply didn't know how the West were living. Now, of course, much of this was propaganda. Nixon was inflating, the level of well-being of people in the West. It was not true that everyone at this stage had all of these goods. They were still, relatively speaking, luxury items. Not everyone had a car. Not everyone had a television set. Not everyone had a washing machine. But more and more people did. And so again, to a certain extent, it is true that the average family in Iowa, for example, would have, let's say, a television, would have a washing machine, whereas the average family in, Warsaw or in Bucharest or in Vilnius in Lithuania would not. They would be scrubbing their clothes with their hands still. They would be going to work on a bus, a trolley bus, or on a tram, or they would be walking there, and they would not be watching television. They would not have these sorts of things. So Khrushchev came back and realized, one of the new directions, one of the pivots that he should make, that he would need to make post-Stalin, after the death of Stalin, was also to pivot away from this period of heavy industry and industrialization that had marked the last decade, and try to start imitating some of the things that he had seen in the West. It wasn't like a Pauline conversion. Historians have in the past, I think, put too much emphasis on this kitchen sink debate, as it's so called, and on this kind of visit to the trade fair in 1959. In fact, Khrushchev's thinking was much more complicated. This was a process of thinking about the economy, thinking about society under communism, and coming to certain conclusions about what was needed. But the bottom line, to a certain extent, is correct. That he saw apparently how people were living in the West. He knew how people were living in the Soviet Union, and to a great extent how people were living in Central and Eastern Europe. And he knew that this kind of consumption, that these sorts of luxury items, that these comfort items were in short supply in his own backyard. And in this sense, it was untrue that communism was delivering. Now, Khrushchev remained optimistic. In this slide, you had this very, very famous quote of "We will bury you." Khrushchev was a very bullish man, rambunctious and very often very noisy, and very straight-speaking, very rough in his manners. He came from a peasant background. He's what the Russians would call a muzhik, sort of like a kolchi is basically what muzhik means. Muzhik is like the Russian equivalent of kolchi. So he spoke in very rough terms, and he essentially said, look, we're now going to focus on this. We've achieved rebuilding societies. We've achieved the fundamentals of the socialist system. We've industrialized, we've collectivized. We're now going to focus our efforts on providing comfort and prosperity for the people, for the ordinary people, for the working people in the Eastern Bloc. And when we do this, because of the superiority of the communist system, it will not be long before we overtake you. And this is what Khrushchev meant when he said, "We will bury you." And in Khrushchev's mind, by the 1980s, communist societies would be fabulously wealthy. They would be working 4 days a week. They would have wonderful holidays. They would have the best cars, the best furniture, the best everything. So, from the mid-50s, the end of the 50s to the beginning of the 1960s onwards, there is a pivot in the way economies are run. Heavy industry is not completely neglected, neither is collectivization, but these things are no longer the only direction, the only focus of the economies in question. Now, the Soviet Union, but also the Eastern Bloc, is attempting to duplicate the kind of comfort items, the kind of luxury items that they have that has sort of been emerging in the West. So mass-producing cars, mass-producing television or radio sets, mass-producing furniture, which is sort of makes living spaces more comfortable and more agreeable to live in. Now we can see some images here. There we have the great Eastern European car, the Trabant. We have radio sets. We have toys. You can do your own looking around and see some of these things. It was, it's kind of, it's sort of interesting in the 21st century. What is called communist retro. So the styles of this early period of communist consumption in the 1960s, the 1970s, and to a certain extent in the 1980s. So the furniture, the fashions, the cars, the clothes. All of this sort of red retro has become very in Central and Eastern Europe. Sort of nostalgia museums and nostalgia exhibitions are really booming in places like Prague, but also places like Bulgaria and places like, to a lesser extent, places like Poland. There's a new fascination with the way that people lived in these days, and I guess that's not entirely, and also in television shows, and in movies and in music and in literature and comic books even, and I suppose that's not a million miles away from where from the West. We were interested in the 1960s, aren't we? And we find we watch shows like Mad Men and the Queen's Gambit, and we're interested in this sort of in the fashions of the time and the music and this kind of thing. So that's also happening in Central and Eastern Europe in the 21st century. In 2020, people are looking back to this sort of stuff. Now, in slide number 8. I've got a picture of the kind of this was very typical of the sort of the so-called consumerist golden age of the 1960s and the 1970s. The communist regimes would fund touristic infrastructure, hotels, dormitories. Very often the factories and the places, the firms in which people worked, they would put on for their workers subsidized holidays. That they would put their workers on a bus, and they could go to holiday on the Black Sea or on in the Baltic coast in the north of Poland, and these sorts of things. This is an image of the hotel in Varna. I've never stayed there actually, although I've been to Varna many times. It's on the Black Sea coast in Bulgaria, and this hotel is known as the Black Sea Hotel. It was built, I think, in the 1970s. People have mixed feelings about it. Most people feel that it's a very ugly building, but nevertheless, this is the kind of these are the kind of things that the communists were building in the 1960s and the 1970s, developing touristic infrastructure, building hotels so that there could be that there would be the provision for mass tourism, and this was something which was happening more and more. And there is actually a link here where you can see some of the examples of the sort of the hotel infrastructure throughout Central and Eastern Europe. These hotels are sort of built to a certain style. There's some more in slide number 9. This is an image of the great Dukla Prague soccer team of the mid-1960s, the world-beating team, the European-beating team, beating Ajax Amsterdam at a Prague stadium in 1967. And so again, I mean, this notion of consumption and leisure time was also going to see sporting matches. The regimes were putting a lot of money into making sure that these teams were very successful. They were creaming off the best players. In the slide, the next slide along is again Lake Balaton. That's a hotel where people could stay relatively cheaply. And in the left-hand corner, right at the bottom, is the Dubrovnik Summer Theatre Festival, which is very popular and still is very popular. Dubrovnik in the south of Croatia, and that is an exhibit. That is a performance of Romeo and Juliet. What do I want to say? Yugoslavia was a little bit more open. We'll find out in a minute than the rest of the Eastern Bloc. So things like William Shakespeare and his plays could be played more easily, whereas in other parts of the Bloc, they were much more prohibitive about what they were showing and were much more restricted in the kinds of things that were allowed to be shown. Some more examples on slide number 11. This is the Kotva department store in Czechoslovakia today in Prague, in the Czech Republic. Again, just to sort of note that shopping, that this kind of thing that you would not associate with a communist society now from the 60s and the 1970s onwards was becoming something that people in Central and Eastern Europe would partake of, or would have the opportunity to sort of do this. I put up the Kotva department store mainly because I think it's a very interesting example of socialist era architecture, and there is a kind of a debate going on throughout the former Bloc, but in the Czech Republic and elsewhere as well, about whether or not that for a very long time these sorts of buildings were very unpopular immediately after communism because they were associated with the communist regime. But a new generation of people, including a lot of friends of mine, are starting to try to protect these buildings. Some of them have been demolished. And there is a changing sense that it would actually be a loss of heritage and a loss of some very interesting examples of architecture if these buildings began to be demolished or began to be destroyed. And I must say, I would be of the opinion that it would be a great shame to lose some of these very interesting sort of architectural examples. Okay, so slide number 10. It is the case. We're going to come back to Yugoslavia quite a lot when we talk about the breakup of the country, when we talk about the war. But for the time being, I just want to sort of highlight the following point. That of all of the Bloc countries, of course, some countries were richer than others and some countries were poorer. It was not the case, just like in the west of Europe. Ireland was one of the poorest countries up until the 1990s. France was richer. Germany eventually was one of the richest, as it is today. In the Eastern Bloc, it was the same. Countries like Czechoslovakia, countries like Eastern Germany were relatively prosperous, whereas, for example, countries like Romania, countries like Albania, countries like Bulgaria were much poorer. And then, people often sort of saw this and felt this. So, for example, Czech tourists coming to the Black Sea coast and staying in places like Varna. The Bulgarians there would sort of see that these people tended to be, seemed to be much more well-to-do, seemed to be much wealthier than other parts than they were. So there was economic differentiation and social differentiation within the bloc. Some countries were richer than others. Socialist Yugoslavia was one of the richest on the bloc, and one of the reasons for this is that when Tito broke away from the Soviet Union, he was supported, at least initially, by many people in the West who were pleased that Tito was challenging Stalin, was challenging the Soviet Union, and that this was a sort of a thumb in the nose to the communist world. This being the Cold War, any chance to sort of get one over on the communists was welcomed. So socialist Yugoslavia was one of the richest countries. It was getting a lot of foreign loans. It was getting a lot of money coming in from the West. And as a result of this, in the 1970s and the 1980s, this phenomenon of consumption was one of the, it was most sort of intense, it was most sort of visible in socialist Yugoslavia. It was also a very well-endowed country. It had this great coastline in the Adriatic in Croatia. Had mountains where people could go hiking in Bosnia or in Montenegro. So it was a very popular tourist destination, not just for the Easterners, but also for people from the West. Very many people wanted to come and visit this country, and as a result, it got a lot of hard currency coming in, on top of the money that was coming in from foreign loans. So what this meant was, in practice, we're going to see that there is a sort of an arc to this consumption, that it starts to arrive at the end of the 1950s. It hits its peak in the 1960s and the 1970s, but then with the economic crisis, the oil shock, and the transformation, the recession of the mid 1970s, which doesn't really end until sort of the end of the 1980s. There was a decline in the sort of the good life, if you like, the good times, the good fortune. And there's a very good book which we have in the library and possibly also on e-copy by a historian called Patrick Hyder Patterson. The book is called Bought and Sold. And it tells the story of the rise and fall of consumption and consumerism within socialist Yugoslavia. It talks about the television shows, talks about the holidays, talks about talks about the good life, talks about movies, talks about leisure time, talks about fashion. But it also shows that when this evaporates at the beginning of the 1980s, Patterson is making the argument that the fact that all of a sudden there is no longer prosperity and there is no longer the good life is a cause for a lot of the social crises that hit the country in the 1980s and ultimately lead to the country's breakup and also to the conflicts of the 1990s. I won't talk too much about that for the time being because we will be talking more about Yugoslavia in a couple of weeks' time. But just for now, it's an interesting point to earmark. Once people have become accustomed to a certain standard of living, as people in Yugoslavia had during the 70s, the 60s, and the 70s, when that is stripped of them, people will feel very pissed off about it. They will feel extremely sort of extremely annoyed to lose the things that they had enjoyed up until quite recently. So the book is Bought and Sold, and it's a very interesting study. And I mean, I remember some of my friends, older friends in places like Serbia and Croatia, would tell me. So I remember sitting in a bar with a friend in Belgrade who was sort of visited London in the late 1970s, and he was saying that he essentially lived like a king there. He could afford to stay wherever he wanted. He could spend money wherever he wanted. The Yugoslavs were really like wealthy people at this time, and of course, the United Kingdom was going through its own crisis and the winter of discontent. It's a very interesting subversion of this notion that the West is rich and the East is much more impoverished. It was not the case in the case of Yugoslavia. Okay, so let's look then in the last few minutes. Let's look at slide number 12. I won't read this quote out, but I do want you to think about it. It's maybe something we'll discuss in one of our sessions. This sudden emphasis on consumption, away from heavy economy and onto things like shopping, department stores, holidays, created a kind of a paradox within the values system of the Eastern Bloc. These were states which were ruled by the communist parties, and their values were anti-capitalist, anti-acquisitive. They were about equality. They were about welfare for all. They were about not exploiting, about bringing everyone up to a decent standard of living. All of a sudden, in the 1960s and the 1970s, because of this sudden reorientation towards the kind of style of living that people were seeing in the capitalist West, the notion that now if you worked hard, you could buy a television, or you could buy a car, or you could buy a nicer apartment. It created a kind of paradox within the system, the paradox can be expressed in the following way. These were communist societies, communist states, which were essentially now encouraging almost like a capitalist mindset, a mindset of work hard, like a bourgeois mindset of work hard, earn your money, and you can spend your money. So it does begin to sort of challenge the ideological purity of the communist systems and of the communist regimes. Now, it's untrue that just because you live under a communist society, you must be impoverished and you must not enjoy television and holidays. That's not the case. Of course, the communists claimed that they were creating a better world, and part of that better world would be recreation time and would be a chance to sort of to unwind and to enjoy the good life. But nevertheless, this sort of compulsive focus in the 60s and the 70s on consumption and on consumerism means that all of a sudden the Eastern and the Western Bloc are not quite as divergent. They are not quite as different as it had been once thought. Okay, finally, let's skip to slide number 14 because I'm sort of running out of time here. We'll talk more about this when we talk about the 1980s, but essentially what happened then was that the good times began to end. The times of relative prosperity and relative plenty began to sort of turn downwards, not just in Eastern Europe, but throughout the world. The oil shock, the recession of the late 1970s, all of these things hit on Eastern and Central Europe as well. And what that meant was that the governments were no longer, in many cases, able to supply the level of consumption and the level of consumerism that they once had done. Now, Bren and Neuberger, and also Patterson for that matter, claim that part of the crisis of legitimacy, part of the rejection on the part of many people towards the communist authorities, towards the communist governments and the communist regimes, was based upon this sudden withdrawal of the good life. That all of a sudden, the sort of the shopping, the cars, all of these sorts of things were kind of taken away, and this meant that in many cases, people blamed this new level of poverty, this new level of lack of prosperity on the governments, and then created a kind of crisis because it wasn't felt as keenly in the West, and all of a sudden a lot of people were thinking, well, they're living much better than us, and we're suffering, and this is simply unfair. Now again, it hit in different levels, and we'll talk more about this when we come to the 1980s. Some countries were particularly hard hit. Poland, for example, under martial law, the Polish Communist Party badly mismanaged the economy in the 1980s, and this created a real groundswell of anger, from workers who weren't getting paid, from people who lived at home who were not getting a level of posterity. When we talk about Romania under Nicolae Ceausescu, We'll talk about his policies of austerity in the 1980s, and we'll see how his attempts to manage the national economy created a terrible grinding poverty within the country. So we'll talk about that as well. But essentially, there are sort of three stages to this story, very roughly speaking, and this will be my last comment. The first stage, the Stalinist stage, is when the economies are geared towards industrialization and geared towards heavy industry and this kind of thing. That starts to subside at the end of the 1950s, beginning of the 1960s, and the countries begin to sort of move towards some level of consumption, the kind of things that I've been talking about in today's lecture. The economic crisis at the late 70s and the 1980s reorients the economies once again, and a new period of austerity, a new period of sort of lack and withdrawal kicks in. And now people are much less willing, now that they've enjoyed the good life, as Patterson calls it, they're much less willing to put up with it being withdrawn. In the 1980s, and as I say, many people argue that this is the beginning of the very serious crisis of legitimacy that the communist governments suffer in the 1980s. Okay, so thank you.